Hello, my name is Catherine McKinnon and I'm the Director of the Centre for Sustainable Communities at the University of Canberra. My background is in human geography and development studies, and I've worked on issues around rural livelihoods, community development and gender equity for the last 20 years. I'm recording this presentation on Djab Wurrung country in central Victoria where I live and work, but the University of Canberra is located on Ngunnawal country in Canberra. Before I go any further, I'd like to pay my respects to country of both these places and also to the countless generations of traditional custodians in the past and in the present who care for country. In this project, Next Generation Agricultural Extension, I'm leading the work on Activity 4, Mapping Livelihood Ecologies for Farming Households. And in this presentation, I'll be talking a bit about what this activity will entail, the approach we intend to use, and some of the methods we're expecting to use in the work. I'm very happy to be part of the team on this project, especially as it's an opportunity to work closely with key partners in northwestern Cambodia. This includes the National University of Battambang, the Bailin Department of Agriculture and Partners for Rural Development, as well as colleagues across Australia in Adelaide, Macquarie University in Sydney and the University of Melbourne. I really hope that what we learn alongside each other through this project will have lasting impacts, that it will support future extension work to help farmers build on their strengths in creating sustainable livelihoods.
So as Brian Cook explained in his overview of the project, the overarching question that's driving the project as a whole is what could the next generation of agricultural extension look like if it began with the premise that farming is about more than human relationships? What if extension started from the assumption that farming is the work and the product of the relationships and collaborations between people, land, plants, animals, equipment, institutions, and all the different ways in which they're connected? We understand that agricultural extension is really about working with the complex and interconnected livelihoods of farmers, their households and their friendship networks, their connection to place, their relationships with people and with non-humans, their aspirations and hopes, what they want to accomplish and why. In other words, the livelihood ecologies of farmers, these complex and interdependent relationships through which farmers make a living on and off the land. The aims of Activity 4 are first to build on the baseline activities that are going to be happening beforehand, Activities 1 to 3, and especially the baseline survey, which will provide an overarching picture of what life is like for farming households in the case study villages. And as Activity 4 takes shape, it will be designed around that learning, and it will shift the project from a mode of surveying, which is a bit more of an extractive way of engaging with participants, to participatory work with farmers, a much more collaborative and co-productive approach. So Activity 4 aims to co-produce an understanding of farmers' livelihood ecologies, this intertwined, interconnected way of building livelihoods. Looking at what are the kinds of assets and resources that farmers draw on in putting together a livelihood. Assets understood to be both material and non-material. So it's the equipment, the land, the seed, but it's also non-material assets like knowledges, skills, and relationships. And we want to know what different roles women and men play in this production system. What about younger and older people? What different kinds of roles and responsibilities do they carry in these livelihood ecologies? And with the participants in this activity, we want to co-produce an understanding of what farmers need in order to live a good life. The first step is going to be creating a shared understanding of what a good life looks like. To have a look at what farmers desire, what their capacities are for changing what they do, and to initiate the co-design of some livelihood interventions that will be followed up in later stages of the project. The way this activity is being designed is based on a series of underlying assumptions. The first is that it draws on a community economy's understanding of livelihood as interconnected and interdependent economic activities. For community economy scholars, the work of making a living for yourself is also bound up in being made by others, receiving from others. And it's about making for others or providing for others, involved often in care work, gifting, helping out neighbours. Ethan Miller uses the word habitat to describe what this is, because the work of livelihood is what creates and shapes how we live, our habitat. In this work, I prefer to use the term livelihood ecology as a way of recognising these multiple and interdependent ways that livelihoods are constructed, recognising that it's not just human lives that are at stake here, but also the lives of earth kin, land, water, species. A second assumption that I build on in this work is that farmers really are the experts on their own social, cultural, political and ecological contexts, and they know how to listen to the land and respond sustainably to what the land is telling them. This is very clear from the preceding project on farmer uptake of agricultural technology, and it also supports the conclusions of my own previous research on agricultural extension efforts, particularly my PhD work undertaken in northern Thailand. I studied the 3-decade-long efforts to introduce alternative crops in the highlands of northern Thailand. And in that context, extension work often failed because projects just didn't do enough to learn from the farmers or listen to the expertise of farmers. The emergence, for example, of the problem census approach in programs funded by Australian aid in the 1980s points to how long-standing the efforts are to shift how extension is done, to start to orient it more to really listening to farmers and building intervention efforts on their expertise. Now, there have been some really important achievements in this regard and a real shift to recognition that participatory approaches, peer-to-peer learning are really important aspects of extension work. But while extension remains really good at offering technical advice that's based on expert knowledge and perceptions, as a field it remains not so good at listening to learn about farmers' expertise and aspirations. So part of what this activity is offering is a model for how to do this listening to farmers and learning from farmers better. The other foundation for this activity is wanting to think with farmers as co-researchers, and that this is how you can create space for identifying key opportunities for future work. And it's a process that is best guided by social science expertise. Usually just going to people and asking them what they want or need isn't a very productive process. In those circumstances, people often default to a dominant narrative of that space in that moment. What do you need? Well, I need more money. Well, what do you need that money for? And having a careful, structured, scaffolded conversation with people can lead to some much more creative and valuable outcomes. We want to know what these farmers in northwestern Cambodia feel is a good life, and to support them in thinking creatively about how to achieve that good life. It may be that increased cash income through higher yields is the thing that will really make a difference to them. But it might turn out that actually having stronger community ties, a decreased sense of isolation, might be much more impactful in terms of improving household health and well-being. And the solutions to something like that will be rather different. To get to these pictures of what a good life is and how to achieve them, we're looking to co-produce outcomes shaped both by the academic researcher and the farmers as co-researchers. It's really important to recognise here that the research process is going to be shaped by the lens that academic researchers bring. When working with groups of people to think together and to co-produce outcomes, these outcomes are ideally shaped by a conversation between the different knowledges and experiences that everyone brings. And the researchers are part of that conversation inevitably. For my part, I'm passionate about helping farmers to find ways to build a sufficient livelihood that enables a more than human community to thrive on equitable terms. So the research questions that are guiding the work in this activity, there are 4 of them. The first is, what are the diverse economic practices and strategies used to build livelihoods for women and men in smallholder households in northwestern Cambodia? So when we're looking at diverse economic practices, we mean the many different ways that people shape a livelihood. What are the sources of income for the household, and what are the different forms of non-cash income or produce that people are engaged in? So this will take into account paid and unpaid work, both that happens on the farm and off the farm, and the reproductive labour that takes place in the household, care work and those sorts of things. The second question is, what are existing material and non-material assets and resources available or being utilised to support these diverse livelihoods? So when we talk about material resources, this is all pretty familiar. This is equipment, it's land, it's seed, that sort of thing. But we're also interested in taking into account the non-material assets and resources. And this can include the kinds of skills and knowledges that people bring to the work they do. It can include the resources that they draw on from their social networks, their relationships with others in the community, the institutions that are around to support them in what they do. And we want to have a look at what are the needs and aspirations of women and men in these households. And we're particularly interested in looking at aspirations and thinking through with farmers, what does a good life look like for you? So from the answers to these first 3 questions, we should get a really good picture of the strengths of households in this part of the world. What are people already doing to make a good life, and to what have they already got that we can build on? What are the strengths and assets that we can build on moving forward into the future? Part of this is understanding what farmers have done and what they're doing at the moment to achieve their aims in life. So looking back over past stories of things they've tried, stories of success and stories of failure. And the role of agricultural extension interventions in those stories. So what agricultural extension interventions have smallholder households experienced in the past, and what could extension do in the future to support livelihoods? What are the kinds of encounters that households have had with extension efforts? What were they like? How did they go? What change came from those, if any? And when you look at what a good life looks like and how you build that into the future, what are some of the ways in which agricultural extension can support progress towards that? The approach overall is informed by a series of concerns shaped around an ethics of recognition and community collaboration. Activity 4 is going to be creating qualitative understanding of farmer livelihoods, and it's going to be doing it collaboratively, most probably in workshops and focus groups, although the exact method through which we build those understandings is yet to be determined. It's building shared understandings of how more than human livelihoods are being created now. So having a conversation so that research and farmers are both gaining new insights and knowledge about what livelihoods look like and the ways in which it involves the relationships and interconnections between different people and between people and the more than human, the land, the seed, the plant, and so forth. From this, we want to create shared recommendations for experimental interventions that will support agricultural livelihoods. So at the end point of this activity, we'll have some ideas, some new experiments shaping up that then activities 5 and 6 will be developing more and working with. In the next few slides, I'm going to go over what we might do to answer each of the research questions and to work in this way that I've outlined. But with the caveat that the team really has a lot of learning to do between now, which is the very beginning of the project, and when we get to the stage where Activity 4 is underway. What we actually do on the ground may not be exactly what I'm outlining here. The tools that I want to use are familiar, they're tried and tested in the field, but are they the best way to build mutual understandings with farmers in this place? And perhaps there are different ways that might better build these shared understandings and come up with shared recommendations. So we're open to learning from the early stages of the project and to working with our collaborators in Cambodia, our partners, and with the farmers themselves to think again about what methods we're actually going to be applying in this case. So to answer research question 1, what we're looking at using is this technique of the floating coconut or the iceberg as it's been used, and depending on whether you're in tropical or less tropical parts of the world. So the question is, what are the diverse economic practices and strategies that people use to build their livelihoods? Now, very often when we think about people's economic activities, we focus only on what we see here as the above the waterline economic activities. So wage labour, commodity markets, capitalist enterprises, formal economic activities. In the diverse economies approach, we're interested in the full range of what it takes to piece together a livelihood for people and for households. And that takes a lot more than just that small set of formal economic activities. This involves all kinds of exchanges and interactions in the informal economy and in non-cash economy. Some examples of this are the kind of work you do to sustain the household, washing clothes, cleaning, cooking food, caring for children. Also the kind of work that you might do in the community. So volunteering your labour to support the temple, for example, giving food to the monks, helping a neighbour on their land, as well as a whole lot of other forms of making an income that aren't part of that classic commodity market or wage labour system. So what I've done in the past with community groups is to work together to get a kind of full picture of what are all the things that you use to create your livelihoods, and to draw together something like the images you see on the screen here, like the floating coconut, where everyone involved can then look together at this big picture, and it really makes visible the value of all the different stuff that you do on a day-to-day basis, and the way in which it helps you live your life, the way that it supports your family and also the community that you live in. So it's a way of making visible and a way of valuing the diverse economic practices that people have at hand. Working together to draw this sort of picture can be a very powerful way to show the richness of livelihood and start to tell a story about yourself that places the agency in your own hands. So it's not that in order to have a good life you need cash, and for that cash you need somebody to give you a job. When you start to think about all the things you do, some alternative pathways can open up, and a better understanding of the strengths that you're already starting with. So the second research question that this activity will be looking at are, what are the existing material and non-material assets and resources that people have in place to utilise to support their livelihoods? This builds on and extends the diverse economies coconut image, and it's about mapping out both the needs that people have and the assets that people have. So what I'm suggesting to be done to answer this question is to apply asset-based community development tools to talk about community needs and assets in a group context. Mapping out needs is really important. It gives people an opportunity to talk about what's not going right, what they don't have, what they need help with, where the gaps and the problems are. We don't leave it there though, because by the end of a session of talking about needs and what's missing, participants will come away with a sense of how terrible things are and how much lack there is in their lives. So then the experience of being part of the research is pretty depressing at that point, and it doesn't give a great sense of what people have at hand that they might utilise, apply, build on in order to address some of these needs, in order to make some positive changes. So working together then to map out assets is an opportunity to bring to the surface what people do have. So this is usually structured through a process that pulls out things like business and physical resources, whether that might be around water supply, transport, the presence of warehouses that are available, public markets that are available locally. It'll draw out associations, institutions, organisations that are in place locally. So whether it's around local government institutions, non-government institutions or groups, or perhaps supports that are available through religious institutions such as the local temple. And it also works through what are the kinds of assets that are held in people and in the practices that they have in place. So labour sharing is often something that comes up around this, but also different cultural practices, practices of mutual sharing and support that can happen around things like life cycle ceremonies, the gifting for the poor in the community, remittance payments that might be coming back from people who are far away, as well as skills and knowledges that people can share with each other. So by the end of a process of mapping assets, people usually come away with a much more hopeful sense of what's possible, as well as some glimmers of, well, if they just could get a little extra support with this part of what they're already doing, then here's a step forward, here's a pathway we can take. And it's from that that we hope to start to get some ideas about what some experiments with livelihood interventions could look like. And I think one of the trickier conversations to be having with the participating farmers, the co-researchers on the ground, will be this question of figuring out what a good life looks like for people. What are the desires and aspirations that shape the lives of people in these households? One of the tools that I've used to do this, that helps to bring up conversations that are around quality of life, around a sense of well-being, but also around equity, is to do a 24-hour clock exercise. And in this exercise, it takes about a half a day, and you work with people to think back over their last normal working day, the one that's sort of in recent memory, to map out for themselves everything that they did during that day, including time for rest and recreation, time for caring for children, time for making food, time working for wages, or time working on the farm. And then to use that as a starting point to think through the balance of time in life, the balance of time given to work, or in the diagram here, it's time for income and time for life. That balance scale isn't the same for a semi-subsistence farming household. It isn't the same for someone who runs a shop in town, but it's a starting point for talking about a bigger sense of well-being, a bigger sense of what's valuable in your life, and to think through your material well-being, the well-being that's associated with the work that you do, your social well-being, your community connections and connectedness, and your physical well-being, your health and well-being. And I think it's important to add here as well one spiritual and psychological sense of well-being too. The way this activity is structured has worked really well in the rural and urban communities in the Asia Pacific where I've used it in the past. But I think in the context of northwest Cambodia, it will probably need to be adapted significantly because work patterns shift so dramatically over the cassava growing season. So this might not be the right way to prompt conversations around patterns of work. The last two questions that we're going to be looking at is around farmers' stories. So what have farmers done and what are farmers doing to achieve their aims in terms of livelihood, and to explore their experiences with agricultural extension in the past and beginning to do some thinking together about what some future agricultural extension interventions might be. So there's several different ways that this can be structured. What I really want to achieve with this one is a chance to think experimentally together, to reflect on what we've learned from answering the first three questions and the activities associated there, to then think about the future, what that should look like, and how external assistance might be able to play a part. So there are a few key ways to structure a storytelling and sharing session. Asking participants for their most significant change story is one of these. Getting people involved in role play can be another one. Asking people in small groups to perform a short play that kind of demonstrates the future that they want to be inhabiting. Using practices of yarning circles, this is also a way to do it, a sort of slow process of building shared understanding. What the way that a group will function around here is really it's crucial that people feel engaged, that it's fun, and that it's hopeful as a process. And really this applies to all the different activities that will be conducted to explore and answer the research questions in this section of the project. And that's that being part of the research process is itself going to be a productive experience. It's not going to leave farmers feeling depressed about their circumstances, but it's going to leave them with a really good sense of what they have to build on and some ideas about what steps they might be able to take. So finally, to sum up. So overall, Activity 4 is going to be exploring a qualitative understanding of farmers' livelihoods. I'm interested in the complex ways in which those livelihoods are constructed, the multiple sources of income, the different kinds of well-being that are supported, the different kinds of commitments and relationships that people have, and what kind of a life they want. What is a good life? What does that look like? So using participatory approaches, most probably through workshops and focus group activities, what we're going to do is to co-produce knowledge with participants, treating the farmers as co-researchers in the process. The exact methods are not yet clear. The pandemic will certainly shape what is possible to do on the ground, but ideally the research team and the farmers will be spending time together discussing and sharing. There's still a question of what are the best ways to work with farmers in this context. And rather than assuming that we already know what are the appropriate methods to use, the design is going to be guided by the cultural expertise and insight of partners and of participants. So by the end of this stage of the project, the team will have an overall map of farmer livelihoods that show the below the waterline aspects of local economic engagements, an understanding of existing livelihood strategies that secure the lives of farming households, a better sense of which of these strategies secure community well-being, which help people to thrive together, which support shared resilience and shared well-being. And we'll be working with farmers to begin a step of co-designing potential interventions, to begin to identify pathways that are likely to support farmers' aspirations and priorities into the future. And this work will be extended in the next stages of the project, leading into the deep dive investigations of stories of success with farming families in Activity 5.